I mentioned in my last vlog video, vlog number 7 I think it was, that I had an unusual find recently. 16 broken snooker cues which I found leaning against a wall behind a bin. People who have been watching my channel for a while will know that I predominantly like to use salvaged materials in my projects. So I gave some thought to what I could use these for, and the first idea I had was using them to make some tapered legs for a coffee table, and that's what I'm going to do in this video. First I wanted to make a top for the table, and for that I'd use this slab of beech. This was around 25mm thick. I took some measurements and there were a few imperfections at one end that I'd need to cut away. I started marking up where I would make some cuts, which I did with my circular saw, just to make the pieces more manageable in size. As this wood was rough sawn, there weren't really any straight edges, so I set up the planer and planed one of the edges on each board straight. And then I could use those straight edges against my table saw fence to cut a parallel edge. Here I'm positioning the pieces to see if I had enough material to work with. I was aiming for between 550mm and 600mm in diameter for the table. Before I could do the rest of the planing, I had to rip one of the pieces to be less wide so that it would fit through my thicknesser. And then it was lots and lots of planing one face, followed by lots and lots of thickness planing the opposite face. During this process my planer stopped working, and I found that the drive belt had snapped, so I had to order a new one of those and wait for a few days for it to arrive so that I could finish off the job that I'd started. With the pieces all cleaned up and a consistent thickness, I put them next to each other and marked up a circle using my beam compass, which I made a few months ago. I'll link to the video I made for that in the description box below. I also marked up some notches where necessary, which would give me a solid area to clamp to for when I glue up the top. I cut those out at the bandsaw. I realised that I could have just ripped these edges earlier at the table saw, but I was really trying to maximise the size of the table I could get from this slab of beech, so that's why I kept the outer edges as they were. I added glue. Then I clamped it up and had a quick look underneath just to make sure that the underside was sitting flat against the bars of my parallel clamps, and it was, so I knew it would be nice and flat. Once the glue had set, I'd use my circle cutting jig at the table saw to cut the circle. I drilled a pilot hole in the centre of the tabletop, and then I added a pin to my jig, set at the right distance from the table saw blade to give me the radius of the circle that I wanted to cut. This pin is just a nail with the head cut off. I wanted to make a bevel cut, so I tilted the blade to 45 degrees. And then I could put the pin into the pilot hole on the underside of the tabletop so that it spins. This method of cutting a circle is not one that I would recommend trying, as there's a high risk of kickback when making cuts like this, so it can be very dangerous. It's really important to not rotate the workpiece while it's in contact with the blade, so I'm pressing down really firmly to prevent it from spinning. I'm also taking these cuts nice and slowly. Please note this footage is sped up quite a lot. I made a series of cuts to remove the excess material bit by bit. Once it was very close to being a perfect circle, I could gradually advance it into the blade and slowly rotate it to nibble away and form the perfect circle. I took a roundover bit and used my trim router to ease over what would be the top edge of the tabletop. And I wasn't sure how this would work because the bearing of the bit would be riding on a 45-degree angle rather than a 90-degree angle. And that meant that it took a heavier cut than usual, but it actually worked fine. It did leave some sharp edges though, so I sanded those back. Then I could clean up the joints with my card scraper to remove any excess glue, and I really should have done this much sooner because at this point the glue was really hard, so it was difficult to remove. I sanded the faces and the edges at 80 grit and then 120 grit. And then I started making the legs. I picked out 4 snooker cues that looked pretty similar. Originally I was just going to have 3 legs on this table, but I wanted to make more of a feature of the snooker cues, so I decided to go with 4. The pale wood here is ash, I think. I'm not sure what the darker wood is. I used the offcut of beech from earlier, the bit with all of the knots and cracks in, to mark up 4 blocks which would be used to make mounting blocks for the legs. I cut those out at the bandsaw. I cleaned these up with a hand plane, as by this point these pieces were too small to safely plane through my thickness planer. Then I marked a centre point onto each block. And using a scrap piece of MDF and a couple of wedges plus some hot glue, I made a simple jig which would help me to drill holes through the mounting blocks at an angle. I also added a scrap piece of wood to the front just to help position each block consistently on the jig. The snooker cues measured about 29mm in thickness at their widest point, and the nearest bit I had was a 30mm Forstner bit, so I'd use that to drill the holes. With the block held on top of the jig, I offered up the centre point to the centre of the Forstner bit, and I drilled all of the way through. I decided to add some bevels to what would be the bottom of each block, and I did that with a hand plane. Then I made some marks where I wanted to cut the legs to length. Using my bevel gauge, I measured the angle of the hole that I drilled through the blocks, and I could then use that to set the angle of my mitre saw, ready to cut the legs to size. Before I did that though, I first used an old hand saw that I didn't really care about to cut through the cues, just to make sure that there was no metal or anything that would damage my blade on the inside of them, and it didn't look like there was. But when I made the cuts at the mitre saw, this happened. So yes, there was metal inside, and I'm guessing that was to add weight to the cues. So that was pretty annoying. Looks like I might need to buy a new blade now. But of course when I used a hacksaw, the inside was just solid wood. Typical. I did some light sanding to each of the legs as they had some wear and tear. Most of the legs looked good, but on one of them I found that the contrast between the dark and light wood wasn't as prominent once sanded, so I pulled out another snooker cue to use instead. To glue the legs into the mounting blocks, I mixed up some epoxy, as it's a great gap filling glue, so it wouldn't matter that my holes were drilled a little bit too wide for the legs. I first added it to the top of the mounting blocks to try and get a seal all of the way around the leg, and then I left that to dry, and then I turned the legs the other way up and filled the gaps from that side too. I then added some 70mm screws through the mounting blocks and into the legs to help secure them in place even more. Because I hadn't made the cuts to the legs at the correct angle, I then needed to cut away the excess at the top of the leg on the bandsaw. And for the bottom of the legs, I just had to take a bit of a guess to get the angle as close as possible, and I could further refine that later on when I level the legs. I rounded over the bottom of each leg at the disc sander. You can see here that I'm using a block just to guide each leg at a consistent angle. And then I did some hand sanding to clean off any burn marks. I could also offer the legs up together, upside down, to check by eye that they were all roughly the same length. And I was never going to get this perfect, but I'll spend some time leveling the legs later on. I just needed them to be pretty close. I added some boiled linseed oil to the legs just to make the grain pop, and after a few days, once I was sure that the oil had cured, I applied a top coat of spray varnish to restore their shininess. Then I could work on finishing the tabletop. I first sprayed on some water. This is a trick I saw in a Jay Bates video and it works really well. The water raises the grain, and once it's dried, I could sand it back with some 400 grit paper. With the water raising the grain rather than the water-based finish raising the grain, it makes it a bit easier to sand it back and get a nice smooth surface. Then I added the finish, and I'm using water-based varnish. I brushed it on in the direction of the grain and took care of any drips around the edges. Then once it was dry, I sprayed on some water and wet sanded at 400 grit just to keep things nice and smooth, and I wiped away the dust. I then applied finish to the underside, and then using some of these blocks with a screw poking through them, I can balance the tabletop onto those while the bottom coat is still wet and apply another coat to the top so that I could carry on working. I gave it 3 coats of varnish, wet sanding in between each coat. I used a framing square to help position the legs where I wanted them, and then I could secure them. After drilling pilot holes and countersinks, I added the screws. And I didn't use any glue here because this table is going to be for sale on my Etsy store, which means I'll need to send it to the buyer, and it'll be much easier to do that and with less chance of damage for the table to be sent disassembled. Finally, I could level the table. I placed it on a flat surface, my table saw's table, to check for wobble. And then by placing some coarse sandpaper beneath the longest 2 legs, I could remove any wobble. I'm really pleased with this one. I think it came out really nice, and the snooker cues make for a really nice feature, I think. I'm not sure how long this one took because it's a project that I kept coming back to in between working on other things, but I reckon it was about a day and a half, maybe 2 days, so about 14 to 16 hours. And the table is now available for sale on my Etsy page, link to that in the description box below if you're interested in checking it out. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to my channel for more weekly woodworking videos if you haven't already, and thank you for watching.